The vacuum of space held no mercy for the dying prison station. Orion drifted like a metallic corpse through the void, its hull scarred by centuries of cosmic radiation and neglect. The nearby star, once a brilliant beacon, now wheezed out its final breaths as a crimson dwarf, painting the station's corroded surfaces in hues of rust and blood. This forgotten corner of the galaxy had become a dumping ground for the unwanted. Uranium dust that glowed faintly in the darkness, frozen pipelines that stretched like arteries through the station's bowels, and convicts who worked until their bodies gave out, their bones added to the ever-growing pile in the station's lower decks. Eli Torc moved through these nightmarish corridors with the steady gait of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by horror. His engineer's coveralls bore the stains of 1,000 repairs, and his weathered hands carried the scars of machinery that bit back. At his side hung an oddity that drew curious glances from the other workers, a rusted sword, its blade pitted and ancient, recovered from a derelict Earth vessel he'd found drifting in deep space years ago. The sword bore a name etched in fading script along its fuller, conscience. According to the ship's corroded logs, it had belonged to a human officer named Marcus Chun during the corporate wars, a man who had refused an execution order when commanded to collapse a mining colony where workers and children lived in the deep shafts. Rather than murder innocents for corporate profit, he had turned his blade on his own commanding officers, then fled with a handful of loyal soldiers to join the resistance. The blade had been passed down through generations of those who chose conscience over convenience, each bearer someone who had faced an impossible choice and chosen to say no. From Marcus Chun to a factory worker who refused to manufacture poison gas. From the factory worker to a teacher who wouldn't falsify historical records. From the teacher to a medic who treated enemy wounded against orders. And finally to the engineer who had found it drifting in space, waiting for its next bearer. The sword was a relic from humanity's pre-stellar age, forged by hand when such craftsmanship still mattered. It bore no nano-enhancement, no molecular sharpening, no technological augmentation. It was simply steel, folded and hammered by human hands, imperfect and mortal. But according to the ship's logs, its previous owner had said something that stuck with Eli. This blade never cut flesh, it cut lies. The other engineers mocked it as useless sentiment, but Eli had learned that sometimes the old ways worked when the new ones failed. Sometimes human will, crude and unrefined, could accomplish what perfect technology could not. The inspection route today took him through Sector 7, a maze of abandoned chambers that groaned with the station's slow death. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on tired eyes. The air recyclers wheezed asthmatically, barely maintaining pressure. It was here, in a maintenance corridor marked only by faded numbers, that Eli discovered the anomaly, a hatch. Not unusual in itself, the station was riddled with them, but this one was different. The metal was ancient, predating even the station's original construction, yet it was sealed with a precision that spoke of desperate purpose. Molecular bonding had fused the edges so completely that not even the plasma cutters in the main workshop could have breached it. The access codes had been scratched away, leaving only the faintest traces of symbols that might have once been numbers. Eli knelt beside the hatch, running his fingers along its edges. The metal was cold, even through his gloves, cold in a way that suggested it had been sealed when the station was young. 3 centuries, maybe more. He'd seen plenty of old tech in his years as a salvage engineer, but nothing quite like this. The bonding was too perfect, too deliberate. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to stay inside. His hand moved instinctively to the rusted sword at his side. The blade had been his constant companion through a dozen salvage operations, useful for prying apart stubborn components when finesse failed. The steel was old, older than anything else on the station, and possessed a peculiar quality that Eli had never quite understood. It cut through materials that should have resisted it, broke apart molecular bonds that plasma torches couldn't touch. The first strike rang through the corridor like a bell. The second sent hairline fractures racing across the hatch's surface. By the third, the ancient seal gave way with a sound like breaking glass, and the hatch swung open on hinges that screamed with protest. The chamber beyond was circular, its walls curved in a pattern that suggested it had been carved rather than built. Emergency lighting flickered to life as Eli stepped inside, triggered by motion sensors that had waited centuries for activation. The air was stale, but breathable, preserved by systems that had somehow continued functioning long after the rest of the station had begun its decline. At the center of the chamber, chained to the wall, was a figure that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. She was alive, impossibly, undeniably alive. Her skin held a blue tinge that spoke of alien heritage, and her eyes, sunken deep in a face marked by suffering, tracked his movement with sharp intelligence. She was tall, her frame suggesting strength even in her weakened state. Muscles that had once been powerful were now reduced by centuries of confinement, yet somehow still taut with discipline. The chains that held her were marked with codes and symbols, their metal darkened with age. As Eli's eyes adjusted to the chamber's dim light, he noticed the walls around her. Every surface within reach was covered in careful scratches, not random marks of madness, but deliberate writing. Names, he realized, thousands of them, carved with painstaking precision into the metal. But these weren't just names, they were stories, memories preserved in metal. A girl named Mullen, one inscription read, 7 years old, died clutching a stuffed animal during the Bolarium evacuation. I ordered the retreat too late. I didn't protect her, but I won't forget. Sergeant Kyrain, 23, shot himself rather than follow orders to execute wounded prisoners. His blood is on my hands, not because I made him pull the trigger, but because I created a world where that seemed like the only honorable choice. Dr. Elena Vasquez, medic, refused to let me stop her from treating enemy wounded. Died from a plasma blast while bandaging a soldier who had tried to kill her an hour before. She said mercy wasn't about deserving it. It was about choosing to be human. Between the names were tactical diagrams, battle strategies, and what looked like letters. Messages to people who would never read them, confessions to ghosts, promises to the dead. Near her right hand, carved deeper than the rest, were the words, "We were idealists once. We believed honor was worth more than life. Were we wrong? 300 years of absolute isolation, and she had refused to let her mind break. Instead, she had turned her prison into a monument to memory, a testament to everyone she had failed to save. Her fingers were scarred from the carving, but her eyes held the clarity of someone who had fought the darkness and won." Their eyes met across the chamber, and Eli felt something shift in the universe around him. This was not a chance encounter. This was destiny, written in rust and starlight. "You are not the one who was supposed to come," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent that belonged to no world Eli had ever visited. The words emerged like dust, as if she had not spoken in decades. Eli approached slowly, his engineer's mind cataloging details even as his heart raced. The chains were unlike anything in his experience. The metal seemed to shift and flow under examination, molecular locks designed by minds far more advanced than anything in the current galaxy. He pulled tools from his belt, ran diagnostics, tested cutting implements. Nothing worked. The chains absorbed energy, redirected force, adapted to every approach. Desperation drove him to try the impossible. He drew the rusted sword, this relic of human defiance, this symbol of choosing conscience over convenience, and touched its blade to one of the chain links. The advanced molecular locks, designed by the greatest minds of a galactic empire, crumbled like ash before crude earth steel, forged by human hands. The irony was not lost on either of them. The Empire's most sophisticated technology, undone by the simple tool of someone who had once made the same choice Lena had made centuries ago. The woman stared at the fallen chain, then at Eli. Her hollow eyes widened with something that might have been hope. "How did you breathe sometimes?" Eli asked quietly, applying the blade to the remaining shackles. The old ways remembered what the new ones forgot. Each touch sent another link crumbling to dust. 3 centuries of imprisonment undone by a blade that had never forgotten the weight of moral choice. As the last chain fell away, she rose to her feet with movements that spoke of combat training, of a body that remembered strength even after centuries of enforced stillness. She was taller than Eli, her blue-tinged skin marked with scars that told stories of battles long past. Her eyes held no gratitude, only weariness, as if freedom were a concept she had learned not to trust. Why did you free me? She asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. Because you're not trash, Eli replied simply. She studied his face in the dim light, her hollow eyes searching for deception and finding none. But you don't know what I did. What if I deserve this? Did you? Eli asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning inward. I refused to kill children. The Empire called it treason. I called it conscience. She met his eyes again. Tell me, engineer, is a system just if it erases those who question it? The question hung between them like a challenge. Eli had spent his life fixing broken machines, following schematics, trusting that the systems he served had been designed by wiser minds. But looking at this woman, this monument to institutional cruelty, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. No, he said quietly. A just system doesn't fear questions. It welcomes them. Because you're not trash, he added. As they prepared to leave the chamber, she paused before one section of the wall where the carved names were densest. Her fingers traced over the letters as if reading Braille. I made myself remember, she said quietly. Every face, every name. In the first decade, I nearly went mad from the silence, but then I realized that if I forgot them, they would truly be dead. So I carved their names, drew their faces from memory, lived their last moments over and over until the pain of remembering became stronger than the pain of forgetting. She turned to face Eli, and he saw that her eyes held not just the clarity of sanity, but the terrible weight of perfect memory. I spent 300 years learning that the strongest chains are the ones we accept. The Empire thought isolation would break me. Instead, it taught me who I really was. He had no idea what he had just set free. But as alarms began to wail in the distance and systems that had slept for centuries suddenly awakened, he knew that her fate was now tied to his. The universe had just become a much more dangerous place. The emergency lights shifted from amber to red as they made their way through the station's corridors. Automated systems that had been dormant were coming online, sending signals across the void to destinations unknown. Someone, somewhere, had been waiting for this moment. Unit 7L was active again, and they were coming. We need to leave, the woman said, her voice carrying an authority that made Eli instinctively trust her judgment. Now they moved through the station's maintenance ways, past sleeping quarters where convicts lay unaware that their world was about to change. The woman moved like a ghost, her footsteps silent despite her size, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. She was a soldier. Eli realized that whatever else she might be, she was a warrior. It was in the cramped confines of Eli's personal shuttle, as they prepared for launch, that she finally spoke her name. Lena Sarayer, she said, the words falling like stones into still water. Former commander of the 3rd Imperial Strike Regiment of the Acer Empire. Even Eli, a simple engineer working the Rim territories, had heard whispers of that name. The Acer Empire had dominated this sector for millennia. Their blue-skinned warriors feared across a dozen star systems. I thought you were a prisoner, he said carefully. I was. Her voice carried the weight of years of decisions that had cost everything. The story emerged in fragments as their shuttle cleared the station's docking bay and accelerated toward the outer system. The order had come from the highest levels of the Imperial command structure: cleanse a refugee camp on the contested world of Bolarium. Wounded civilians, children who had fled from a war they didn't understand, all were to be eliminated to prevent them from becoming a burden on Imperial resources. Younger Lena had stood in her command tent that day, staring at the orders in disbelief. Her aide, a fresh-faced lieutenant, had waited for confirmation. Commander, your orders were soldiers, she had whispered to herself, not executioners. Now, centuries later, the same words echoed in her mind as she looked out at the gleaming capital. Lena had stood before her regiment, looked into the faces of soldiers who trusted her leadership, and made a choice that would define the rest of her existence. She had refused, not quietly, not with diplomatic protests. She had stood before the Imperial Tribunal and declared the order an atrocity. In her memory, she could see her younger self at the tribunal, spine straight, voice unwavering. I swore an oath to protect the innocent. That oath doesn't come with exceptions for convenience. The ghost of her younger self seemed to stand beside her now, as vivid as if 3 centuries hadn't passed. "We were idealists, remember?" the young Lena whispered. "We thought honor was worth more than life. We believed the uniform meant something." "It did mean something," the older Lena replied silently. "It meant we had the power to choose who lived and who died. The question was whether we'd use that power wisely. But look what it cost us," her younger self said, gesturing to the rusted walls of their shared prison, 300 years alone. "Was it worth it?" "Ask me that question when we reach the surface," the older Lena answered. "Ask me again when we see what the galaxy has become." The Empire's response had been swift and terrible. Execution would have made her a martyr. So instead, they chose Eraser. Lena Sarayer was marked as a traitor, her name stricken from records, her very existence denied. She was locked away in the deepest, most forgotten corner of Imperial space, left to die slowly in the darkness while the galaxy forgot she had ever lived. But the cruelest cut of all was the identity of the officer who had signed her confinement order, Susa, her younger sister. The memory surfaced unbidden as Lena spoke. Sasa's face 3 centuries ago, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held the execution warrant. The younger sister had pleaded, begged the tribunal to find another way. But the Empire demanded blood for disobedience, and the choice was simple. Execute the traitor publicly, or make her disappear quietly and let Sasa's career survive to serve the greater good. "I can't sign this," Sasa had whispered that night, her hands trembling as she held the stylus. "She's my sister." "Then sign it for peace," the High Chancellor had replied. "Your sister chose her path. Now you must choose yours. The Empire needs stable leadership. The people need to believe in order. One death or millions in civil war. You decide." Sasa had signed, not from ambition, but from terror. Terror that the Empire would tear itself apart if the truth of Lena's trial became public. She had condemned her sister to save her civilization, trading one life for billions. The mathematics of power had seemed so clear then, but mathematics had no room for the weight of centuries, for the slow poison of compromise, for the way fear calcified into tyranny. The woman who now ruled the Empire had built her throne on the foundation of that one terrible choice. Each subsequent decision made it harder to remember the frightened girl who had wept over her sister's fate. "Is she still alive?" Eli asked as they entered hyperspace, the stars stretching into lines of light around them. "The Empire still stands," Lena replied, staring out at the flowing void. "Renewed, changed, but alive. And at its head sits my sister, wearing the crown that should have been mine." Their course was set by half-erased star maps that existed only in Lena's memory, fragments of navigation deity that had somehow survived 3 centuries of mental isolation. The destination, Acer Prime, heart of the Empire, the world where Lena's story had begun and where it would end. Eli didn't know where this path would lead them, but he knew now that this was about more than survival. This was about return, about justice, about settling a debt that had been accumulating interest for 300 years. The journey took them through systems that bore the Empire's mark. Pristine space stations, patrol fleets that moved with military precision, worlds that gleamed with the prosperity that came from order imposed at sword point. They traveled in a salvage shuttle that barely registered on Imperial sensors, just another piece of refuse moving through the void. As they approached Acer Prime, Lena's demeanor changed. The stoic warrior gave way to something more complex, a woman returning to a home that no longer knew her name. The planet hung before them like a sapphire jewel, its surface covered in gleaming cities and orbital installations that spoke of power beyond imagination. "It's beautiful," Eli whispered. "It's built on silence," Lena replied, her voice bitter. "Every gleaming dome, every perfect street, they're monuments to lies." They landed in the planet's industrial sector, their shuttle lost among thousands of others in the sprawling spaceports. The air was clean, recycled, and purified to Imperial standards, but it tasted of sterility to Eli's palate. This was a world where nature had been tamed, where chaos had been eliminated, where perfection was maintained through the careful application of force. Moving through the city's underground levels, they made their way toward the capital district. The transportation tunnels were filled with workers heading to their assigned duties, their movements choreographed by centuries of routine. No one looked at Lena. No one recognized the face that had once commanded legions. In the central plaza, massive screens displayed the Empire's daily propaganda broadcasts. There, among the carefully crafted messages of unity and strength, was an image that made Lena stop cold. Her own face stared back at her from the screens, but altered, distorted. The proud bearing was gone, replaced with something cruel and twisted. Below the image, text scrolled past in the Empire's official script. Lena Sarayer, terrorist, fabricated myth, enemy of unity. They didn't just erase you, Eli said quietly. They turned you into something else. They made their way to the old military district, moving through streets that Lena had once walked in triumph. The barracks where she had commanded her regiment had been converted into a museum, the Museum of Imperial Victory. According to the marble plaques that adorned its entrance, holographic displays inside showed the great battles of Imperial history, the heroes who had died for the glory of the Empire. Lena's name was nowhere to be found. Her plaque had been removed, her face airbrushed from group photographs, her victories attributed to others. It was as if she had never existed. In a hidden vault beneath the museum, accessed through maintenance tunnels that Lena remembered from her younger days, they found what they were looking for. Ancient data cores hummed with power, their contents protected by security systems that had been state-of-the-art 3 centuries ago. Eli's engineer skills proved invaluable here, bypassing electronic locks that had been designed before his kind of thinking existed. The files were all there. The tribunal recordings, the charges, the evidence of war crimes that the Empire had wanted to ignore, and most damning of all, the recordings of the trial itself. Lena standing before her accusers, refusing to bend, choosing honor over survival. They buried it, Lena said, her voice cold as she watched her younger self speak words that had condemned her to centuries of suffering. But graves can be opened, Eli replied, his hands already moving over the data systems. The Empire's information networks were too heavily monitored to allow for direct infiltration, but Eli had learned other methods during his years in the Rim territories. If they couldn't flood the networks, they would flood the streets. The truth would spread like a virus, pass from hand to hand, mind to mind, until it reached critical mass. They began with the simplest approaches, data fragments copied by hand onto recycled paper, key phrases scribbled across alley walls in fading marker. The word spread like wildfire through the city's underground. You are alive. She refused to kill. Truth is buried. It was in a workers' district cafe that they met her. Kira Thane, barely 20, with eyes that burned with the fierce idealism of youth. She had been one of the first to recognize the graffiti for what it was, organizing underground gatherings where workers shared the fragments, piecing together the story like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered vase. I know who you are, she whispered to Lena during their 3rd clandestine meeting. My grandfather fought in the border campaigns. He used to tell stories about the commander who saved his unit at Balerium Station. Said she was the only officer who cared more about her soldiers than her career. Lena studied the young woman's face, seeing in it the same desperate hope she had once carried herself. That was a long time ago. I'm not that person anymore. No, Kira said firmly. You're something better. You're proof that some people never break. Kira became their voice in the underground networks, organizing the distribution of truth with the passion of someone who had never known a world where heroes weren't erased from history. She wrote songs, haunting melodies that carried fragments of Lena's story, sung in workers' quarters and student gatherings, spreading like viruses through the Empire's perfect order. In the darkness, chains can't hold what was never meant to die. She refused, and in that choice, made the stars themselves reply. The Imperial propaganda machine was designed to control massive information flows, not to stop whispers in dark corners. Graffiti appeared overnight, too small and scattered for the authorities to track. Songs emerged in the workers' districts, lyrics that seemed innocent until you knew the code. Veterans began to gather in quiet corners, sharing memories that had been officially forgotten, led by a young woman whose voice carried 3 centuries of suppressed truth. I dream of seeing you standing in the light, Kira told Lena one evening as they prepared the final phase of their plan. not as a ghost, but as who you really are, a hero the galaxy remembers instead of forgets. In the shadows of the gleaming capital, the Acer Empire began to tremble. Arrests were made, curfews were imposed, security sweeps intensified. But the fire had already caught, spreading through the city's veins like an infection. The Day of Remembrance was approaching, the Empire's most sacred holiday, when citizens gathered to honor the sacrifices made for imperial glory. Susa Sar would address the nation from the Capitol Plaza, her words broadcast to every world under imperial control. It would be the perfect moment to reveal the truth that had been buried for 3 centuries. In the hours before dawn, as they made final preparations in the maintenance tunnel beneath the plaza, Lena sat in silence, her hands resting on the rusted sword. The weapon remained sheathed. She had not drawn it since breaking her chains. This was not about war, not about conquest. This was about truth. Eli watched her in the dim emergency lighting, noting the way her breathing had steadied, the way her shoulders had straightened. She looked like a soldier preparing for battle, but there was something else in her posture, a strange peace, as if she had already accepted whatever would come. Eli, she said quietly, not looking at him, if I don't return from this, will you tell our story? The question hung in the air like a prayer. He wanted to tell her she would survive, that they would escape together, that this wasn't goodbye. But they both knew the mathematics of the moment. One woman against an empire, one voice against a symphony of lies. I will, he promised. Every word, she nodded, finally meeting his eyes. Do you think someone can be a hero if no one witnesses their sacrifice? Eli considered this, thinking of all the unnamed engineers who had died keeping life support running, all the forgotten medics who had saved lives in unnamed conflicts. I think the universe keeps its own accounting, he said finally. Heroes don't need audiences. They just need to be. Freedom, Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. What is freedom really? Is it the absence of chains or something deeper? I used to think freedom was about having choices, Eli replied. But watching you these past days, I think maybe freedom is when you're not afraid to die for what's true. Lena smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. Then I have been free for 300 years, even in chains. They could imprison my body, but they could never touch what I knew to be right. Lena and Eli moved through utility shafts and forgotten tunnels, past checkpoints that didn't know to look for ghosts. With each step closer to the plaza, Eli could hear Lena's heartbeat. Steady, measured, the rhythm of someone walking toward destiny. The Capitol Plaza was a sight to behold on the Day of Remembrance. Imperial banners hung from every building, their blue and silver fabric rippling in the carefully controlled breeze. Military bands played stirring marches while formations of soldiers stood at attention, their armor polished to mirror brightness. Citizens filled every available space, their faces turned upward toward the central podium, where their empress would soon appear. Susa Sar emerged to thunderous applause. Her figure was commanding even at a distance. She bore resemblance to her sister, the same proud bearing, the same piercing eyes, but where Lena had carried the weight of conscience, Sasa radiated the cold certainty of absolute power. Her uniform was a work of art, decorated with medals that commemorated victories built on her sister's erased legacy. The speech began with the traditional words, honoring the fallen, celebrating the Empire's destiny among the stars. Sasa's voice carried clearly across the plaza, amplified by speakers that ensured every citizen heard her message of unity and strength. Then silence. A figure emerged from the crowd, moving with deliberate steps toward the platform. Time seemed to slow as thousands of eyes turned to track her movement. The security forces reacted, hands moving to weapons, but something in her bearing made them hesitate. She walked not like an assassin, but like someone arriving at a long-delayed appointment. Lena's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she climbed the steps. Each footfall echoed in the sudden quiet, the only sound in a plaza that held its breath. Her tattered cloak fell away as she reached the platform, revealing the bearing of a soldier, the scars of survival, the hollow dignity of someone who had refused to break. The crowd's reaction was a wave of contradictions, gasps of recognition from the older citizens who remembered her face from before the erasure, confused murmurs from the young who knew only the propaganda version, and underneath it all, a growing current of electric tension as people began to understand they were witnessing something that would reshape their world. For a long moment, the sisters stared at each other across the platform. Then Sasa dismissed her guards with a gesture, her voice barely audible. "Leave us." The authority in her voice broke no argument, though her hands trembled as she spoke. The platform emptied, leaving the two women alone before thousands of watching eyes. The amplification system still carried their voices, but in this moment, the vast plaza might as well have been a private room where two sisters faced the wreckage of their shared past. "You came back," Sasa whispered, and her voice cracked like breaking glass. "I never left," Lena replied. "You put me in a cage and tried to forget I existed, but I was always here, watching what you became." Sasa's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she took a step forward. "I didn't know how else to save everyone. The Empire was fracturing. If your trial had become public, if the people had learned that even our best officers were refusing orders, there would have been civil war. Millions would have died." "Millions died anyway," Lena said quietly, "in camps you never visited, on worlds you never named, in wars you fought to maintain your peace." "You didn't save everyone, Sasa. You just chose which deaths to notice." "I tried to do what was right," Sasa's voice rose, desperation bleeding through every choice. Every compromise, every decision. It was all to hold us together, to prevent chaos. "You saved no one," Lena's words fell like stones. "You simply left me alone to carry the weight of what we both knew was wrong." In her mind, the young Lena from centuries past spoke softly. "She used to build sand castles with us, remember? On the beach behind our grandfather's house. She always made sure the walls were thick enough to hold back the tide. Some tides can't be held back." The older Lena replied to her younger self. She chose to save her castle by letting us drown. Sasa staggered as if struck. "I thought about you every day, every night. Do you think it was easy? Do you think I wanted to? But you did it anyway." Lena's voice was gentle now, but merciless in its clarity. "That's the difference between us, sister. When faced with an impossible choice, you chose to preserve the system. I chose to preserve my soul." "Tell her about the nightmares," her younger self whispered. "Tell her how we used to wake up screaming her name." "No," the older Lena said firmly. "Some pain is meant to be carried alone. She has enough guilt to bear." Around them, the plaza held its breath. History was being written in real time, not in the language of politics or strategy, but in the raw truth that passed between two women who had loved each other before the universe taught them they were enemies. The rusted sword remained sheathed at Lena's side, a symbol that this confrontation would be won with words, not steel. She had not come to spill blood. She had come to spill truth. "I didn't come for the throne," Lena said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "I came so you'd remember what you forgot." In her mind's eye, she could see herself 3 centuries ago, standing before the refugee camp she had refused to destroy. Children playing in the mud between makeshift shelters, their laughter echoing off wounded walls. "We were supposed to protect them," her younger self had said to her lieutenant. "When did protection become slaughter?" "We still remember," whispered the ghost of her youth. "We still remember why we said no. And now they'll remember too." The older Lena replied silently. Some lines should never be crossed. Sasa's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, recognition, and finally a grief so profound it seemed to age her decades. Moments later, her hand moved not to her weapon, but to her throat, as if the weight of 3 centuries of silence was finally choking her. "Kill her," she commanded. But her voice cracked on the words, and everyone in the plaza could hear the sound of a heart breaking. The first shot came not from the guards, but from the crowd. An old veteran, his weathered face marked by service ribbons, raised a captured weapon and fired into the ranks of security forces. Then another civilian joined him, and another, until the plaza exploded into chaos. Eli fought beside Lena as Imperial troops tried to restore order. The rusted sword, Conscience, moved like liquid light in her hands. Its ancient metal cut through modern armor as if it were paper. Each strike sent pieces of advanced battlesuits clattering to the ground, revealing the frightened soldiers beneath. The blade that had once refused to cut innocent flesh now cut only the lies that protected tyranny. In the midst of the battle, Kira appeared at Lena's side, her young face bright with fierce joy. "It's working," she shouted over the chaos. "The whole city is rising. They're singing your songs in every district." A plasma bolt seared the air between them. Lena spun, raising conscience to deflect another shot, but the Imperial sniper had already adjusted his aim. The next bolt was aimed directly at Lena's chest. Kira moved without thinking, throwing herself forward. The plasma burst caught her full in the torso. Her body jerked with the impact, and she fell against Lena, her eyes already glazing with shock. "I dreamed of seeing a world where you weren't a ghost," Kira whispered, blood frothing on her lips. "Where you were the hero they remembered instead of the one they forgot. Did I help make that real?" "Yes," Lena said, cradling the young woman's head as life ebbed from her eyes. "You made it real." Around them, the battle raged. Workers threw down their tools and picked up weapons. Students linked arms and charged police lines. Even some Imperial soldiers hesitated, unwilling to fire on their own people. But for Lena, the world had narrowed to the weight of a young idealist who had died believing in a future she would never see. They weren't fighting to win. That would have been impossible against the Empire's might. They were fighting to be seen, to exist, to prove that some truths couldn't be erased no matter how deeply they were buried. And now, to honor the sacrifice of those who believed freedom was worth dying for. The battle raged across the plaza as more citizens joined the uprising. Workers threw down their tools and picked up weapons. Students linked arms and charged police lines. Even some Imperial soldiers hesitated, unwilling to fire on their own people. Smoke began to veil the sky as fires broke out across the district. Emergency sirens wailed like the voices of the damned, and the carefully orchestrated celebration became a nightmare of violence and revelation. The Empire's perfect facade cracked and bled, revealing the brutality that had always lurked beneath. Sasa vanished in the chaos, spirited away by her personal guard to some secure location where she could plan her response. But her absence spoke louder than any words. The Empress of the Acer Empire had fled from a sister she had thought safely buried. When the smoke finally cleared, the plaza was broken. Shattered marble lay scattered across ground that had been stained with blood. The Imperial banners hung in tatters, their proud symbols reduced to scraps of fabric that fluttered in the wind like prayer flags for the fallen. Lena had survived the initial battle, but as Eli helped her through the escape tunnels, he could feel the wetness spreading across her back. Plasma burns, deep and merciless, had found their mark. Despite the chaos, they made it to a safe house in the industrial district, but both knew she was dying. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain. "Days," Eli admitted. His engineer's honesty was brutal but necessary. "Maybe less." She nodded, unsurprised. "Then I need to write." For 3 days and nights, as her strength ebbed like a tide pulling away from shore, Lena wrote. Not on paper, but directly into a portable data core. Her words flowed like blood from an open wound. She told the whole story. The refugee camp, the refusal, the trial, the centuries of imprisonment. But more than that, she wrote about choice, about the moments when every soul must decide who they truly are. "To anyone who finds this," she wrote, "I am not your hero. I am not your martyr. I am simply someone who learned that freedom isn't something you take. It's something you choose again and again, even when the cost is everything you love." A young woman named Kira died believing in a future where truth mattered more than comfort. She never lived to see that future, but her faith in it made it possible. There have been countless others like her, people who chose to stand when it would have been easier to kneel, who sang songs of resistance when silence would have been safer, who died believing that their sacrifice would plant seeds in hearts they would never know. The Empire wants you to believe that order requires silence, that peace demands the burial of inconvenient truths. They are wrong. Peace built on lies is just war waiting to happen. The only lasting peace comes from facing what we've done, admitting our failures, and choosing to be better. I refused to kill children for political convenience. For this, I was erased. But erasure is not the same as destruction. As long as one person remembers, as long as one voice speaks truth, The light continues to burn. Do not make me a symbol. Make your own choices. Break your own chains. Sing your own songs. Be free. On the fourth morning, Eli found her still and peaceful, the data core clutched in her lifeless hands. Her face wore an expression of quiet contentment, as if she had finally laid down a burden too heavy for any one person to carry. Eli took the data core and did what any good engineer would do. He made copies, thousands of them. He uploaded her words to subspace networks, broadcast them on emergency frequencies, embedded them in shipping manifests and maintenance reports. The Empire sensors worked frantically to contain the spread, but truth, once released, moves like light through a vacuum. Within weeks, the letter had reached every corner of Imperial space. Workers read it in factory break rooms. Students passed printed copies between classrooms. Veterans shared it in quiet conversations over drinks. The word spread like wildfire, and with it came a new symbol. Broken chains, spray-painted on walls, etched into workbenches, worn as pendants by those who chose to remember. The movement that grew from Lena's final words called itself the Broken Chains. Eli became their voice, not as a leader, but as a witness, telling her story to anyone who would listen. He never claimed to be a hero. He was simply a man who had freed someone from literal chains and learned that some prisons exist only in our minds. The Empire endured, wounded but not fallen. Sasa remained on her throne, but her rule was forever marked by the sister she had failed to save. In quiet moments, citizens would catch her staring at empty spaces, as if seeing ghosts that only she could perceive. In the Museum of Imperial Victory, a new display appeared without official authorization. No one could determine who had placed it there. A rusted sword mounted behind simple glass, with no nameplate, no explanation, only a small inscription etched into the blade itself, Conscience. Below it, a second inscription in plain text, this blade never cut flesh. It cut lies. She didn't want to be a goddess, only free. Beside the sword, someone had left a collection of handwritten song lyrics, the words that had spread through the underground networks in a young woman's voice. The museum guards found fresh flowers there every morning. Simple wildflowers that grew in the workers' districts, left by anonymous hands that remembered not just a commander, but the idealist who had died believing in her. The museum guards were ordered to remove it multiple times, but it always reappeared. Eventually, they stopped trying. Visitors would stand before the display in silence, reading the inscription, understanding in their hearts what official histories could never capture. Eli never returned to the core worlds. He worked the rim territories, fixing broken machines, and telling stories to anyone who would listen. On his workbench, half of a broken chain served as a paperweight. He carried copies of Lena's final letter. Sometimes, late at night, when the stars were bright and the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, he would read her words aloud to the darkness. Freedom isn't something you take. It's something you choose again and again, even when the cost is everything you love. The Empire had tried to bury Lena Sarayer twice. The first time they had failed because chains could not hold her spirit. The second time they failed because some truths, once spoken, can never be silenced. In the end, she had achieved something greater than victory, more lasting than revolution. She had planted a seed in the collective conscience of a galaxy, and that seed would grow in ways she never could have imagined. 300 years of silence, broken by one voice saying no. 100 years later, in the archives of the Galactic Historical Institute, scholars debated the existence of Lena Sarayer. The records were fragmentary and contradictory. Some claimed she was a myth, a symbol created by revolutionaries to justify rebellion. Others insisted she had been real, pointing to weapon fragments that bore the molecular signature of pre-stellar Earth steel, to architectural evidence of ancient prison cells, to the persistence of the broken chains movement across dozens of worlds. The Acer Empire still stood, but it had changed, slowly, imperceptibly at first, like a massive ship altering course. The same structures remained, the same titles and ceremonies, but something fundamental had shifted in its soul. Dissent was no longer erased. It was studied, debated, sometimes even adopted. The Imperial Academy now taught a course called Ethical Command Decisions, where young officers studied historical cases of orders refused and the consequences that followed. The transformation hadn't been revolutionary, it had been evolutionary. Each generation of leaders faced with the question, what would history say if I chose silence? Each citizen asking, what chains am I accepting that I could break? In the Imperial Constitution, amended 3 times over the century, was a clause that had never existed before. No order shall be considered valid if it violates the fundamental dignity of sentient life, and no officer shall be punished for refusing such orders after due consideration. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast. But it was change, the kind that lasted because it grew from within rather than being imposed from without. In a small classroom in the Imperial Education Center, the same building that had once housed the Museum of Imperial Victory, a teacher showed her students a holographic recording from that long-ago day of remembrance. The curriculum had changed over the decades. Where once students learned only about glorious victories, they now studied the ethics of choice as a required subject. The recording was poor quality, corrupted by decades of copying and recopying, but the eyes of the woman on the platform burned with unmistakable clarity. A young girl, no more than 10, raised her hand. Teacher, why didn't she take the throne? She could have ruled the empire, made it better. The teacher paused the recording, studying the frozen image of a woman who had chosen truth over power, justice over comfort, freedom over safety. Around the woman's waist hung a rusted sword, conscience, that had never been drawn in anger, only in service to liberation. Because she understood something important, the teacher said gently. You can't order someone to be free. You can't command conscience. You can only teach people why these things matter and trust them to make their own choices. Another child spoke up. But the empire is still here. Did she fail? Did she, the teacher asked, looking around the classroom. Look around you. 100 years ago, questioning authority was treason. Today, it's part of your education. The empire didn't disappear. It learned. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, but helping them become something better. The child stared at the image, trying to understand. In the woman's hollow eyes, she saw something that the history books could capture better now than they once had. The terrible beauty of a choice made not for glory or revenge, but for the simple truth that some things are more important than life itself. Did her sister ever forgive her? Another student asked. I think they both forgave each other, the teacher said softly. But more importantly, the empire learned to forgive itself for needing to be taught what honor really meant. As the lesson ended and the children filed out, chattering about their homework assignments on historical moments of moral choice, the teacher remained behind, staring at the frozen image in quiet contemplation. In moments like this, she sometimes wondered if the real lesson wasn't about Lena Sarayer at all, but about the choices that each generation must make, the chains they must choose to break, the freedoms they must choose to preserve. Somewhere in the vast archive of human experience, a voice whispered across the centuries, freedom isn't something you take. It's something you choose again and again, even when the cost is everything you love. 40 years after the Battle of the Plaza, in a modest repair shop on the industrial moon of Kepler-7, an old man sat with his apprentice, teaching her the finer points of quantum resonance calibration. Eli Torc had aged gracefully, his hands still steady despite the decades, his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had once freed a prisoner and changed the galaxy. On his workbench, serving as a paperweight, sat half of a broken chain. Master Eli, his apprentice said, looking up from her work. Her name was Zara, and she had been listening to his story since she was 12. You've told me about the commander, about the sword, about the battle, but you've never told me why you kept this. She gestured to the chain fragment. Eli set down his tools and picked up the piece of metal, turning it over in his weathered hands. Because it reminds me that some prisons exist only in our minds. Lena spent 300 years in chains, but the moment she chose to remember instead of forget, to hope instead of despair, she was already free. Is that why you want me to have it? Zara asked quietly. Eli looked at her. This young woman who had grown up hearing his stories, who understood the weight of choice without having lived through its consequences. This is just iron, he said, placing the chain fragment in her palm. But once it was part of something that held back the light. Now it's proof that even the strongest bonds can be broken by conscience. Do you want me to fight? She asked. No. Eli's voice was gentle but firm. I want you to never become someone who has to be fought. I want you to remember that every day we choose who we are. Every small kindness, every moment of courage, every time we choose truth over comfort, those are the real victories. Zara closed her fingers around the chain fragment, feeling its weight. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I make the wrong choice? Then you make a different one tomorrow, Eli said. Strength isn't about never failing. It's about never stopping, trying to do better. Outside the shop window, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, unchanged by human ambition or suffering. But somewhere among those points of light, children were learning that freedom wasn't a gift handed down from authority. It was a choice made fresh each day by ordinary people who decided that conscience mattered more than comfort. The galaxy had moved on, but the questions remained, waiting for each new generation to discover them. In a repair shop on an insignificant moon, an old engineer passed a fragment of broken chain to a young woman who would carry its lesson to stars not yet born. Freedom isn't something you take. It's something you choose again and again, even when the cost is everything you love. The lesson was simple. The living of it would take a lifetime.